The rope of the church bell cut through the cold morning air as Ilara Whitmore was pulled by her wrist through the crowded street of Ashcombe. Her feet dragged against the mud, her eyes wide with panic, while her stepmother Miriam gripped her arm so tightly that pale marks were left on her skin. "Stop pulling me like this," Ilara cried, trying to twist free. "You cannot do this. You cannot sell me like a sack of grain." Miriam did not slow down. Her face was hard and cold, the same face she wore whenever money was involved. "I am not selling you," she snapped. "I am saving this family. You should be thanking me instead of making a scene in front of the whole village." Around them, villagers stopped their morning chores to watch. Some whispered behind their hands. Others simply stared, unwilling to interfere. Everyone in Ashcombe knew what was happening. In 1 hour, Ilara would be married to a man the village called nothing more than a crippled beggar, a man who lived alone at the edge of the forest and who no one truly knew. Ilara's chest tightened as they reached the small stone chapel. The wooden doors stood open, and a cold draft slipped out from inside, carrying the smell of old candle wax. She turned to Miriam one last time, her voice breaking. "Please," she said, "I am begging you, do not make me do this." Miriam's eyes did not soften. "Begging will not change anything. The debt is due tonight and this marriage pays it in full. Be grateful someone was willing to take you at all." Ilara's stomach turned. She had heard the rumors about the man waiting inside, a man named Corwin, who walked with a limp and leaned on a wooden cane wherever he went. Some said he had been cursed by a witch. Others said he had once been a soldier who lost his leg in battle and had gone mad from the pain. No one could say for certain because Corwin rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were few and careful. Nora, Ilara's closest friend since childhood, pushed through the small crowd and grabbed her hand. Her eyes were full of worry. "Ilara, is there truly nothing we can do?" Nora whispered. Ilara shook her head, tears building in her eyes. "Miriam has already taken the money. There is no undoing it now." "Then be careful," Nora said, squeezing her hand. "Nobody in this village knows anything real about that man. Watch yourself." Before Ilara could answer, Miriam pulled her forward again, dragging her toward the chapel steps. The cold stone beneath her thin shoes made her shiver, though it was not only the cold that made her body tremble. It was fear of the unknown, fear of a life she had never chosen, and fear of the man waiting silently at the altar. As she stepped through the doors, the noise of the village faded behind her, replaced by a heavy silence. The chapel was small, lit only by a few candles that flickered against the stone walls. And there, standing near the altar, was Corwin. He was taller than Ilara expected, though his shoulders were slightly bent from the weight he placed on his cane. His clothes were plain and worn, patched in several places, yet clean. His dark hair fell just above his eyes, which were the one part of him that did not match the rest of his humble appearance. They were sharp, calm, and unusually steady for a man the village dismissed as broken. Ilara froze for a moment at the sight of him. She had imagined an old man, hunched and dirty, someone who matched every terrible story whispered about him. Instead, the man before her looked young, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with a quiet strength in his posture despite his injury. Miriam gave Ilara one final push toward the altar before stepping back, a satisfied look crossing her face as the village priest, an elderly man named Father Aldous, opened his worn book of prayers. "Let us begin," Father Aldous said softly, glancing between the two young people with something close to pity in his eyes. Ilara barely heard the words of the ceremony. Her mind was spinning, replaying every warning she had ever heard about the man beside her. She stared at the stone floor, refusing to look at him, refusing to accept that this was truly happening. Then unexpectedly, a quiet voice spoke beside her. "You do not have to be afraid," Corwin said, so softly that only she could hear. "I will not hurt you." Ilara's eyes shot up to meet his. She had expected many things from him, cruelty, indifference, even madness, but not gentleness. His voice carried none of the roughness she imagined a beggar would have. There was something careful in the way he spoke, almost practiced, as though he was choosing every word with great thought. She did not answer him. She could not trust a stranger's words, especially not on a day when her entire life had been decided without her consent. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged, though Alara's voice trembled through hers, barely audible. When it came time for Corwin to speak his vows, his voice was steady and clear, carrying a strange weight of sincerity that confused her further. Why would a man forced into this arrangement, just as she had been told, speak with such conviction? When Father Aldous finally pronounced them husband and wife, a heavy silence settled over the small gathering. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the quiet shuffle of villagers exchanging uncertain glances. Miriam, however, wore a small, satisfied smile, already thinking of the debt that had just been erased from her shoulders. As they stepped outside the chapel, Alara pulled her arm away from Corwin the moment his hand brushed against hers to help her down the steps. She would not accept kindness from a man she did not understand, a man the entire village feared and mocked in equal measure. "I can walk on my own," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Corwin nodded once without argument and stepped back to give her space. If her words had hurt him, he did not show it. His face remained calm, almost unreadable, as though he had long ago learned to hide whatever he truly felt. The walk back through the village was silent and uncomfortable. Villagers peered from windows and doorways, whispering as the strange new couple passed. Alara kept her eyes forward, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She had once dreamed of a wedding filled with joy, surrounded by people who loved her. Instead, she had been paraded through the streets like a prize traded away to settle a debt. When they reached the edge of the village, where the road turned into a narrow path leading toward the forest, Alara hesitated. She had never gone this far from the village center, and the thought of leaving everything familiar behind, her home, her friend, the only life she had known, filled her with a fresh wave of panic. "Is it much farther?" she asked, her voice quieter now, some of her anger fading into exhaustion. "Not far," Corwin answered. "It is a simple place, but it is warm and it is safe." She wanted to laugh at the word safe. Nothing about this day felt safe. Yet something in the calm certainty of his tone made her pause. There was no hesitation in his words, no uncertainty, as though he was used to reassuring people, used to leading them somewhere without fear. They continued walking, the village sounds fading behind them, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Alara stole a glance at Corwin as they walked. His limp was noticeable, yet he moved with more control than she expected, his cane striking the ground with a steady, practiced rhythm. She wondered briefly how a man who could barely be seen begging for food in the village square managed to walk such a long distance without struggle. But she pushed the thought aside, too overwhelmed by the events of the day to make sense of anything. As they walked deeper into the woods, the path narrowing beneath overhanging branches, Alara felt a strange chill settle over her, not from the cold, but from a growing sense that nothing about this day or this man was quite what it seemed. She did not yet know how right she was. The cottage appeared suddenly through the trees, smaller than Alara expected, but far from the crumbling shack she had imagined. Its stone walls were sturdy, its roof neatly thatched, and a curl of smoke rose gently from the chimney, as though someone had been tending the fire in preparation for their arrival. A small garden grew along one side, rows of herbs and vegetables planted with obvious care. Alara stopped at the edge of the small clearing, staring at the home before her. "You live here alone?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I do," Corwin answered, pushing open the wooden door. "It is not grand, but it has always been enough for me." She stepped inside cautiously, half expecting filth and disorder, the kind of home a beggar might keep. Instead, she found a clean, orderly space. A modest table sat near the hearth, two simple chairs beside it. Shelves lined one wall, filled with jars of dried herbs, a few worn books, and neatly folded cloth. A narrow staircase led to what she assumed was a sleeping loft above. "Sit, please," Corwin said, gesturing toward the table. "You must be tired." Alara lowered herself into one of the chairs. still clutching the small bundle of belongings Miriam had allowed her to bring, little more than a spare dress, and a wooden comb that had belonged to her mother. She watched Corwin move around the small kitchen area, preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit with practiced ease despite his limp. "You seem comfortable here," she said carefully, studying him. "For a man the village says has nothing." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "The village believes many things," he said simply. "Not all of them are true." She wanted to press further, but exhaustion from the day's events settled heavily over her, and she said nothing more as he placed a plate before her. The food was simple but well prepared, and despite her earlier anger, her stomach growled with hunger she had been too nervous to notice until now. They ate in silence for several minutes before Corwin spoke again. "You do not have to trust me tonight," he said. "I only ask that you allow yourself to rest. Tomorrow will bring what it brings." Ilara studied him carefully across the table. There was something in the way he spoke, formal in a manner that did not match the rough clothing he wore or the humble cottage around them. She had grown up around farmers and tradesmen, men who spoke plainly and often carelessly. Corwin's words were different, chosen with a precision that felt out of place for a man who begged along the village roads. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" she asked before she could stop herself. He paused, his cup halfway to his lips. "Like what?" "Like someone educated," she said. "Beggars do not usually speak with such care." A faint, almost sad smile touched his lips. "Perhaps I was not always what the village believes me to be." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood, gathering the empty plates, effectively ending the conversation. Ilara watched him move toward the small basin near the hearth, more questions forming in her mind than answers. That night Corwin insisted she take the small sleeping loft above, while he remained below near the fire, wrapped in a worn blanket. Ilara lay awake for a long while, staring at the low wooden ceiling, listening to the quiet crackle of the dying fire below. Despite everything, despite her anger and fear, she found herself thinking not of escape, but of the strange, careful way Corwin had spoken to her, and the questions that lingered from his unfinished words. The following days settled into a quiet, uncertain rhythm. Ilara rose early each morning, unwilling to remain idle despite her circumstances. She helped tend the small garden, familiar work from her years, helping in her father's fields before his passing left her at Miriam's mercy. Corwin, despite his limp, worked alongside her more often than she expected, though she noticed he always seemed to know exactly which tasks required strength and which did not, as though he had studied labor rather than lived it his whole life. One morning, while gathering herbs near the edge of the garden, Ilara noticed a small wooden chest tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, visible only because the board had shifted slightly out of place. She knelt down, curiosity pulling at her despite every instinct warning her against prying into her husband's secrets. The chest was locked, a simple iron latch holding it closed, but even without opening it, she could see the craftsmanship was far too fine for a man who claimed to own nothing. The wood was polished, carved with a small, elegant design along its edges, unlike anything she had seen owned by the poor families of Ashcombe. Footsteps sounded behind her, and she quickly pushed the floorboard back into place, standing just as Corwin entered the room. "Looking for something?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the floor where the chest lay hidden. "No," Ilara said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I was only cleaning." He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to press the matter further, before simply nodding and moving past her toward the kitchen. Ilara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her mind racing with questions she did not yet dare to ask aloud. Later that same week, Ilara accompanied Corwin into the village to trade a portion of their garden's harvest for supplies they could not grow themselves, mainly flour and salt. The moment they entered the village square, whispers followed them, villagers watching the strange pairing with open curiosity. Near the market stalls, a group of young men lounged against a fence, watching the crowd with idle amusement. Among them was Silas, a boy Ilara remembered from her childhood, known throughout Ashcombe for his cruel jokes and careless disregard for others. "Well, look who it is," Silas called out as they passed, his friends snickering beside him. "The beggar's new wife. Tell me, does he beg for food, or does he beg for you to stay?" Alara's face burned with humiliation as laughter rippled through the small crowd gathered nearby. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the ground rather than endure another moment of public mockery. But before she could respond, Corwin stepped slightly in front of her, his expression calm, yet something in his posture shifted, becoming still and controlled in a way that immediately silenced the laughter around them. "That is enough," Corwin said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority that seemed impossible for the humble figure he presented. Silas's smirk faltered. "Or what? What exactly is a crippled beggar going to do?" Corwin took one slow step forward, his cane striking the ground with a deliberate sound. He said nothing further, only held Silas's gaze with a steady, unblinking stare. Something in that look, something Alara could not quite name, made the color drain from Silas's face. Within moments he mumbled a hurried excuse and disappeared into the crowd, his friends following closely behind, all traces of their earlier laughter gone. Alara stared at Corwin in stunned silence as the market slowly returned to its usual noise around them. "How did you do that?" she asked quietly. He looked terrified. Corwin did not answer immediately, guiding her gently toward the next stall instead. "Some people simply understand when they have gone too far," he said finally, his tone deliberately vague. She wanted to argue, to demand a real answer, but something in his expression told her this was not the moment. Still, the incident lingered in her mind throughout the rest of their errands, another small piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. That evening, as they walked the quiet path back toward the cottage, the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees, Alara found herself studying Corwin more closely than before. His limp remained, unchanged, yet everything else about him seemed increasingly at odds with the identity the village had given him. "You are not who they say you are," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Corwin glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "No," he admitted quietly, "I am not." "Then who are you?" she pressed, stopping on the path to face him directly. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze drifting toward the darkening forest around them as though searching for the right words, or perhaps deciding whether she deserved them yet. "There will be a time to tell you everything," he said at last. "But that time is not now. For your own safety it is better if you know less." Frustration flared within her, yet beneath it, something else stirred as well. A growing awareness that the man beside her carried burdens far heavier than his limp suggested, secrets that reached far beyond the quiet cottage they now shared. They continued walking in silence, the weight of his unfinished words settling between them like a shadow neither could yet name. Weeks passed, and slowly, without either of them speaking of it directly, a fragile routine formed between Alara and Corwin. Mornings were spent tending the garden, afternoons filled with small chores around the cottage, and evenings often ended in quiet conversation by the fire, though Corwin remained careful never to reveal too much about himself. Alara found herself watching him closely during these quiet hours, noticing details she had missed before. He read often, more than any villager she had known, working through the small collection of worn books on the shelf with a focus that suggested education rather than simple curiosity. When she once asked where the books had come from, he only said they had been given to him long ago, offering no further explanation. One cold evening, as rain tapped steadily against the cottage roof, Alara noticed Corwin wince sharply while shifting his position near the fire, his hand pressing briefly against his injured leg. "Does it pain you often?" she asked gently, setting aside the mending in her lap. He hesitated before answering, as though unused to being asked such a direct question. "More in the cold," he admitted. "It is an old injury. It does not heal the way such things should." "How did it happen?" she asked, watching him carefully. His expression grew distant, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "A mistake," he said quietly. "One that cost me more than my leg." Alara wanted to press further, but something in the heaviness of his voice told her this was not simply an old farming accident or a childhood fall, as the village rumors suggested. There was pain in his words that reached far deeper than physical injury. "I am sorry," she said softly, surprising herself with the sincerity in her own voice. Corwin glanced at her, something shifting behind his careful expression. "You need not be sorry for something you did not cause," he said, "though I thank you for the kindness." The conversation ended there, but something had changed between them, a small crack forming in the careful distance they had maintained since their wedding day. Alara found herself, against her earlier resolve, beginning to care what happened to the quiet, guarded man across the fire. A few days later, word spread through the village that a young boy named Toby, the son of a poor widow named Greta, had fallen seriously ill with fever. The widow had no means to pay for a healer, and the village priest could offer little beyond prayers. Alara heard the news while trading at the market and returned home troubled, unable to stop thinking of the sick child and his desperate mother. That evening she mentioned it to Corwin, expecting only sympathy in return. Instead, he grew unusually quiet, his gaze distant as though turning something over carefully in his mind. The following morning, Alara woke to find Corwin already gone from the cottage, his cane and coat missing from their usual place by the door. She waited through the morning with growing worry, unsure whether to be concerned or simply confused by his sudden absence. He returned near midday, moving more slowly than usual, clearly exhausted from whatever journey he had undertaken. When she asked where he had been, he offered only a brief explanation, that he had visited an old acquaintance who dealt in medicines. That same evening, word reached the cottage through a passing neighbor that young Toby had received medicine from an anonymous source, delivered quietly to Greta's door with no explanation and no request for payment. The fever, though still dangerous, had begun to break by nightfall. Alara studied Corwin carefully across the dinner table, saying nothing of her suspicions, though her mind raced with questions. A beggar with no coin of his own could not have afforded rare medicine, nor could he have traveled far enough in a single morning to reach a healer skilled enough to prepare it. Yet she said nothing, sensing that whatever answer he might give would only be another careful half-truth. Days later, while cleaning the small loft where she slept, Alara discovered a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath a loose plank near the window, likely forgotten rather than deliberately hidden. Her curiosity, already stretched thin by weeks of unanswered questions, overcame her hesitation, and she carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was elegant, clearly written by someone of considerable education, and though much of the letter's meaning escaped her, certain words stood out sharply. It spoke of loyalty, of a house under threat, and of a plan that required patience before action could safely be taken. At the bottom of the parchment, half torn away, remained the fragment of a wax seal, its design unlike anything she had seen used by common merchants or village officials. Her hands trembled slightly as she refolded the parchment and returned it carefully to its hiding place, her mind spinning with new questions that only deepened the mystery surrounding her husband. Whoever Corwin truly was, he was involved in matters far beyond the quiet, humble life he presented to the village. That night, unable to sleep, Alara lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of the cottage below. Sometime past midnight, she heard the soft creak of the front door opening, followed by careful, deliberate footsteps moving away from the house. She rose quietly and crept to the loft window, watching through the darkness as a familiar figure moved across the moonlit clearing toward the forest path, his limp noticeably less pronounced than usual, as though the late hour and solitude allowed him to move without the careful performance he maintained during daylight. Alara's heart pounded as she watched him disappear into the tree line. Every instinct told her to remain in the safety of the cottage, to trust that whatever business called him into the forest at such an hour was not her concern. Yet the accumulated weight of unanswered questions, the hidden chest, the elegant letter, the sudden change in his walk, pushed her curiosity beyond caution. Quietly, she dressed in the darkness, pulling a warm shawl around her shoulders before slipping down the narrow stairs and out into the cold night air. The moon hung low and bright above the trees, casting silver light across the path where Corwin's footprints remained faintly visible in the soft earth. She followed at a careful distance, staying close to the shadows of the trees, her heart racing with both fear and determination. The forest at night felt vastly different from its familiar daytime quiet, filled with unfamiliar sounds and shifting shapes that made her pulse quicken with every step. After what felt like an endless stretch of careful, silent walking, Alara spotted Corwin ahead, standing in a small clearing bathed in moonlight. He was no longer alone. A second figure stood facing him, tall and cloaked, their face hidden beneath a dark hood despite the mild evening. Alara pressed herself against the rough bark of a nearby tree, straining to hear their quiet conversation, though the distance and hushed tones made it difficult to catch more than fragments of their words. "Word has reached the capital," the cloaked figure said, their voice low and urgent. "They grow suspicious. It will not be long before they search beyond the borders of Ashcombe." Corwin's response was too quiet for Alara to hear clearly, though his posture had shifted entirely from the careful, humble stance he maintained around the village. He stood straight now, his weight barely favoring his injured leg, speaking with the calm, measured authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than pitied. The cloaked figure suddenly dropped to one knee, bowing their head low before rising again. "Whatever you require, my lord, it will be done." Alara's breath caught sharply in her throat. "My lord." The words echoed through her mind, shattering every assumption she had carried since the day of their forced marriage. Whoever Corwin truly was, he was no beggar, and the secrets he carried reached far beyond anything she had imagined. A twig snapped beneath her foot as she shifted for a better view, the sound sharp and unmistakable in the quiet night air. Both figures turned instantly toward the sound, and Alara's heart lurched with panic as Corwin's sharp gaze locked directly onto the shadows where she stood hidden. For a long, terrifying moment, no one moved. Then Corwin spoke a quiet word to the cloaked figure, who nodded once before disappearing swiftly into the darkness of the trees, leaving the two of them alone in the moonlit clearing. "Alara," Corwin said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger she expected, only a tired kind of resignation. "You should not have followed me." She stepped out from behind the tree slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, though whether from fear or the cold night air she could not say. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who was that man, and why did he call you lord?" Corwin remained silent for a long moment, studying her carefully across the small clearing, as though weighing the consequences of every possible answer. "There are things about me," he said finally, "that I have not been able to share, not because I wish to deceive you, but because the truth carries danger far beyond what you can imagine." "Danger to who?" Alara pressed, refusing to back down despite the fear tightening in her chest. "To me, to you." "To both of us," he admitted quietly, "and to others who depend on my silence remaining unbroken." Alara wrapped her arms around herself, the cold finally beginning to seep through her shawl. "I am your wife," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and something closer to hurt. "Whatever danger you carry, I am already tied to it. Do you not think I deserve to understand what I have been pulled into?" Corwin's expression softened slightly, the careful mask he wore around the village slipping just enough to reveal genuine weariness beneath. "You deserve far more than I have given you," he said quietly. "And soon, I promise, you will understand everything, but not tonight and not here where anyone might be listening." He extended his hand toward her, an unspoken request for trust that she was not entirely certain she could give. Yet standing alone in the dark forest, cold and frightened, with more questions than answers swirling through her mind, Alara found herself reaching forward and allowing her hand to rest in his. Together, they walked back toward the cottage in silence, the weight of everything unsaid settling heavily between them, while somewhere deep within her, Alara began to suspect that the truth waiting to be revealed would change everything she thought she understood about the man she had unwillingly married. Morning arrived with a pale gray light filtering through the loft window, though Alara had barely slept. The events of the night before replayed endlessly in her mind: the cloaked stranger, the bow, the word Lord spoken with such certainty. When she finally descended the narrow stairs, she found Corwin already awake, sitting at the table with 2 cups of warm tea prepared, as though he had been waiting for her. "Sit," he said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I owe you an explanation, even if it cannot yet be the whole truth." Alara lowered herself into the chair, wrapping her hands around the warm cup more for comfort than warmth. "I am listening." Corwin was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with obvious care. "I was born into a family of some standing," he began. "A family that made enemies through no fault of my own, enemies who believed removing me would serve their ambitions. I was injured badly in an attack meant to end my life entirely. Since then, I have lived quietly, hidden from those who still believe I no longer exist." "And the man in the forest," Alara asked, "he called you Lord, what does that mean?" Corwin met her eyes steadily. "It means that what remains of my household still honors an oath made long before my injury, an oath they continue to keep even in my absence from the world I once belonged to." "Then why marry me?" Alara asked, the question she had wondered since the very first day finally spoken aloud. "Why choose a stranger, someone with nothing, to share in whatever danger surrounds you?" For the first time since she had known him, something like vulnerability crossed Corwin's expression. "Because a man believed dead needs no attention drawn to himself," he admitted quietly. "A quiet marriage to an unknown village woman raised no questions, drew no suspicion. It was meant to protect my disguise, nothing more." The words landed harder than Alara expected, a fresh wave of hurt rising even though she told herself she had no right to feel betrayed by an arrangement she had never wanted in the first place. "So I was simply useful to you," she said quietly. "A convenient shield." "That was my intention at first," Corwin admitted, his voice softening. "I will not lie to you about that, but intentions change, Alara. In the weeks since our wedding, you have become far more to me than a convenient arrangement, though I understand if you cannot yet believe that." Alara said nothing, uncertain whether to trust the sincerity in his voice or guard herself against further disappointment. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything still left unsaid, until a sharp knock at the cottage door broke the tension entirely. Corwin rose immediately, his posture shifting back into the careful, humble stance he wore for the village as he moved to answer the door. Alara watched, startled, as Miriam pushed her way inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes scanning the small cottage with obvious calculation. "Well," Miriam said, her gaze settling on Alara. "It seems married life agrees with you. You look far better fed than I expected for a beggar's wife." "What do you want, Miriam?" Alara asked, standing quickly, unease coiling in her stomach at her stepmother's unexpected arrival. Miriam's attention shifted toward Corwin, studying him with a calculating look that made Alara distinctly uncomfortable. "I have been thinking," Miriam said slowly, "about how a man with nothing manages to keep such a well-stocked home, about how medicine appeared for the widow's son with no explanation, about certain rumors I have heard from a merchant who claims to have seen a fine ring hidden in your belongings." Alara's stomach dropped. Someone had seen the signet ring, likely during one of their trips to the market when Corwin occasionally carried it, perhaps out of necessity she did not yet understand. Corwin's expression remained carefully neutral, though Alara noticed the slight tension building in his shoulders. "Rumors are easily created by those looking for coin, Miriam. I would think you, of all people, would understand that well." Miriam's smile turned sharp. "Perhaps, or perhaps there is more truth to this particular rumor than most. Whatever secret you are hiding, husband of my stepdaughter, I imagine certain people would pay handsomely to learn it." "Are you threatening him?" Alara asked, stepping forward despite the fear tightening in her chest. "I am simply stating a fact," Miriam said coolly. "Secrets are valuable, especially secrets belonging to men who appear far too comfortable for beggars. I will give you both time to consider how grateful you might be for my continued silence." Without waiting for a response, Miriam turned and left the cottage, the door closing firmly behind her. Ilara turned to Corwin immediately, panic rising sharply in her chest. "She will not stop until she has torn every secret from you," Ilara said. "You do not know her the way I do. Greed rules everything she does." Corwin's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm when he spoke. "Then we must be more careful than before. There are people searching for me. Ilara, dangerous people who would not hesitate to act on any information that reached them, especially information sold by someone with no loyalty beyond her own gain." "What people?" Ilara pressed. "Who wants you dead and why?" Corwin hesitated, clearly weighing how much more he could safely reveal. "My cousin," he said finally, his voice heavy with something close to old grief. "A man who believed my family's position belonged rightfully to him, and who arranged the attack that nearly ended my life. He believes I am dead. If he learns otherwise, he will not rest until that mistake is corrected." Ilara's blood ran cold at the certainty in his voice. "Then Miriam could get you killed, simply for a handful of coin." "Yes," Corwin admitted quietly. "Which is why we must find a way to silence her curiosity before it spreads any further." That afternoon, Corwin left briefly, returning some hours later with a small pouch of coins, enough, he explained, to satisfy Miriam's immediate greed without revealing anything of substance. Ilara accompanied him to Miriam's home reluctantly, watching as her stepmother accepted the payment with obvious satisfaction, though the calculating gleam in her eyes suggested this would not be the last demand she made. As they walked back toward the cottage in the fading afternoon light, Ilara glanced sideways at Corwin, studying the tension still visible in his posture despite his effort to appear composed. "This will not be enough to keep her quiet forever," Ilara said. "You know that as well as I do." "I know," Corwin admitted grimly, "which means we must prepare for what comes next, whatever that may be." Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of everything she had learned pressing heavily against her chest. Only weeks ago, she had believed herself trapped in a marriage to a broken, powerless man. Now, she found herself tangled in a web of hidden identities, dangerous enemies, and secrets that threatened to unravel violently at any moment. Yet despite the fear coiling tightly within her, Ilara realized something had shifted within herself as well. The anger she once carried toward Corwin had softened into something far more complicated, a fragile trust beginning to form despite every reason she had to remain guarded. That night, as they sat together by the fire, the silence between them felt different than before, heavier with unspoken understanding rather than simple distance. Ilara studied Corwin's face in the flickering firelight, searching for the man the village believed him to be and finding, instead, someone far more complex, far more burdened, and far more determined to protect the fragile life they had built together, despite the dangers now closing in around them both. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, breaking the silence, "I would rather know the truth and face it beside you than remain safely ignorant while danger gathers unseen." Corwin turned to look at her, something warm and grateful softening his careful expression. "Then I promise you," he said quietly, "when the time comes you will know everything. Every truth I have carried, every danger that follows me, you will face it with full knowledge, not blind trust." Ilara nodded, though a quiet unease remained settled deep within her chest, a certainty that whatever truths still waited to be revealed would test both of them far beyond anything they had yet faced. Several nights after Miriam's visit, with the cottage door bolted and the shutters drawn tight against the darkness outside, Corwin finally sat Ilara down and began to tell her everything, the full weight of a story he had carried alone for nearly 2 years. "My true name is Raynor," he began quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on her, as though the memories were easier to speak while looking elsewhere. "Raynor of House Ivelmoor. My father was Duke Alaric, a man respected across the entire region for his fairness and his refusal to bend to corruption, even when it would have profited him greatly." Ilara sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the truth she had suspected finally took clear shape before her. "I was raised to inherit his position," Rayner continued. "Trained in matters of law, in the management of land and people, in the responsibilities that come with holding power over thousands of lives. It was a heavy weight, even as a young man, but one I accepted willingly, believing I would serve as fairly as my father before me." "Then what happened?" Alara asked softly, though she already suspected the answer would be painful. Rayner's jaw tightened. "My cousin Garrick believed the title should have passed to him instead, through a distant claim he had convinced himself carried more weight than it truly did. For years, he hid his resentment well, smiling at family gatherings, offering false loyalty at every turn. I had no reason to suspect him of anything beyond simple jealousy." He paused, his hands tightening slightly where they rested on his knees. "2 years ago, my father sent me to oversee a dispute at the edge of our lands, near a mountain pass called Thornridge. Garrick offered to accompany me, claiming he wished to prove his usefulness to the family. I welcomed his company, foolishly believing his intentions were genuine." Alara leaned forward slightly, sensing the story approaching its darkest point. "We were ambushed on the return journey," Rayner said, his voice growing quieter, heavier. "Men hired by Garrick himself, though I did not know that at the time. My guards were killed defending me. I was struck from my horse, and in the fall my leg was shattered against the rocks below the pass. I remember very little after that, only pain, and the sound of Garrick's voice giving orders to finish what the fall had started." "He tried to have you killed," Alara whispered, horror settling deep in her chest. "He believed he succeeded," Rayner confirmed. "I was left for dead among the rocks, my body broken enough that no one thought to question whether I still breathed. It was only through the loyalty of one man, Osric, my father's most trusted steward, that I survived at all. He had grown suspicious of Garrick's sudden interest in accompanying me and followed at a distance, arriving just after the attackers had left." Alara thought suddenly of the cloaked figure in the forest, the man who had bowed and called Rayner Lord. "Osric found you," she said quietly. Rayner nodded. "He carried me to a hidden healer far from Ivelmoor's lands, someone skilled enough to save my life, though not skilled enough to fully repair the damage to my leg. For weeks, I drifted between life and death, unaware of what was happening beyond the small room where I recovered." "And your father," Alara asked carefully, "did he know you survived?" A shadow of deep grief crossed Rayner's face. "By the time I regained enough strength to send word, my father had already fallen ill from grief over my supposed death, a grief Garrick used skillfully to secure the family's remaining loyalty behind himself as acting steward of our lands. My father passed only months later, believing his only son had died in that mountain pass." Alara reached forward instinctively, resting her hand over his, offering silent comfort for a loss she could hardly imagine. "I wanted to return immediately," Rayner continued, his voice thick with old pain. "To reveal the truth, to expose Garrick's betrayal before the entire region. But Osric convinced me otherwise. Garrick had spent months solidifying his position, gathering loyal men, spreading his influence throughout Ivelmoor's court. Had I returned too soon, injured and without proof of his betrayal, I would have simply given him reason to finish what he started, this time more carefully." "So you hid instead," Alara said softly, beginning to understand the full weight of the disguise he had carried since. "You became a beggar, someone no one would think to look for." "It was the safest option available to me," Rayner confirmed. "Osric helped establish this cottage, close enough to observe Ashcombe and the surrounding lands, far enough from Ivelmoor's main, a state that Garrick's spies would have little reason to search here. For nearly 2 years, I have lived quietly, gathering what proof I could of Garrick's betrayal through Osric, and a small number of loyal contacts who still believe in House Ivelmoor's rightful leadership." "And the marriage?" Alara asked, though gently now, understanding shifting the sharp edge her earlier hurt had carried. "A marriage to an unknown village woman drew no attention," Rayner admitted. "It strengthened the disguise, made the beggar Corwin appear settled, unremarkable, exactly the kind of man no one would suspect of hiding a noble identity beneath worn clothing, and a false limp exaggerated just enough to discourage close inspection. Alara studied him carefully, noticing for the first time how deliberately he favored his injured leg, a limp that was real, she realized, but perhaps not quite as severe as he allowed the village to believe. "How close are you," she asked quietly, "to gathering enough proof against Garrick?" Raynor's expression grew serious. "Closer than I have been since the attack. Osric has spent months quietly gathering testimony from men who witnessed Garrick's orders that day, men loyal enough to my father's memory to risk speaking against his supposed successor. Within a matter of weeks, perhaps sooner, we may have enough evidence to bring the truth before the regional court. And when that happens," Alara said carefully, "Garrick will know you survived. He will know exactly where to find you." Raynor met her gaze steadily. "Yes, which is precisely why Miriam's threats concern me so deeply. If word of my identity reaches beyond this village before we are prepared to act, before evidence is secured and allies are ready, Garrick may move against us long before we are able to defend ourselves properly." A heavy silence settled between them, the fire crackling softly as Alara absorbed the full weight of everything Raynor had revealed. The quiet, humble life she had resented upon her arrival now carried the shadow of nobility, betrayal, and danger far greater than anything she had imagined possible in the small village of Ashcombe. "Why tell me all of this now?" she asked finally. "You could have continued keeping me in ignorance. It would have been simpler, perhaps safer for you." Raynor turned his hand beneath hers, gently closing his fingers around her own. "Because ignorance no longer protects you, not with Miriam already suspicious, not with danger drawing closer regardless of what I choose to share. And because," he added, his voice softening further, "you deserve honesty from the man who calls himself your husband, regardless of the circumstances that first brought us together." Alara felt something shift within her chest, warmth spreading gently through the fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of her recent life. She studied Raynor's face carefully, seeing him now not as the broken beggar the village mocked, nor simply as the hidden duke burdened by betrayal, but as a man who had chosen honesty despite every reason caution might have offered instead. "Then let me help you," she said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever comes next, whatever danger Garrick brings, I would rather stand beside you knowing the truth than remain hidden away, waiting helplessly for whatever happens." Something close to relief and gratitude softened Raynor's careful expression, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for perhaps the first time since she had known him. "You are stronger than I gave you credit for when this arrangement first began," he admitted quietly. "I am grateful more than you know. That fate placed you beside me through all of this." Alara returned his smile hesitantly, though beneath the fragile warmth building between them, worry continued to gnaw steadily at her thoughts. Somewhere beyond the quiet safety of their small cottage, a man who had already tried once to end Raynor's life remained unaware that his cousin still lived, still gathered strength, still prepared quietly for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. And somewhere closer, within the very village they called home, Miriam's greed continued to grow, a dangerous thread that threatened to unravel everything Raynor and Osric had worked so carefully to protect. As the fire slowly burned low that night, Alara remained awake long after Raynor had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep beside her, her mind turning over every detail of the story she had just learned, searching for some way to help protect the fragile peace they had built, before the shadows of Raynor's past finally caught up to consume them both. In the weeks that followed, something quietly changed between Alara and Raynor. The careful distance that had once defined their marriage began to soften into something warmer, built not on the circumstances that had forced them together, but on the honesty they now shared. Alara found herself looking forward to their quiet evenings by the fire, to the small moments when Raynor's guarded composure slipped just enough to reveal genuine warmth beneath. She began helping him more directly, memorizing the names Osric mentioned during his careful visits, learning the layout of Ivelmoor's estate from Raynor's descriptions, understanding the political relationships that would matter once the truth of his identity was finally revealed. What had once felt like an overwhelming burden slowly transformed into shared purpose, a partnership neither of them had expected when their forced marriage began. "You learn quickly," Rayner observed one evening, watching as Alara repeated back the names of 3 regional lords whose support would prove crucial once Garrick's betrayal was exposed. "Faster than most nobles raised specifically for this kind of knowledge." Alara allowed herself a small, proud smile. "Perhaps I simply have good reason to learn well. Your safety depends on it now, as much as your future position does." Something warm flickered behind Rayner's eyes at her words, though he said nothing more, simply returning his attention to the maps spread across their small table, tracing the route Osric would need to travel to reach the regional court safely. Yet even as their bond grew stronger, the danger surrounding them continued to build steadily beneath the surface. Miriam's visits became more frequent, each one carrying thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly concern. She never asked directly for more coin, understanding perhaps that overt greed might finally push them toward desperate action against her. Instead, she simply mentioned, almost casually, how curious certain travelers passing through Ashcombe seemed about rumors of a hidden nobleman living quietly among common villagers. "She grows bolder," Alara said one evening after Miriam's latest visit, frustration clear in her voice. "She knows we cannot risk exposing her threats without drawing more attention to ourselves." Rayner's expression remained carefully controlled, though Alara had learned to recognize the subtle tension gathering in his shoulders whenever Miriam's name arose. "She is testing how far she can push before we offer more than coin to keep her satisfied," he said grimly. "Which means we are running out of time to act before she decides simple silence is no longer worth her restraint." That same week, Osric arrived unexpectedly during the early morning hours, his usually calm expression carrying an unmistakable urgency that immediately set Alara's nerves on edge. "We have secured testimony from 2 of the guards present during the attack," Osric reported quietly once inside the cottage, glancing carefully toward the shuttered windows as though even here, walls might carry unwelcome ears. "Men who were ordered by Garrick himself to ensure you did not survive the fall. They are prepared to testify before the regional court, provided we can guarantee their safety once Garrick learns of their betrayal." Rayner's expression hardened with renewed determination. "Then we finally have what we need." "Nearly," Osric cautioned. "But there is troubling news alongside this progress. Garrick has grown suspicious in recent weeks, aware that certain loyal households have begun quietly gathering support against his position. He has increased security around the estate and, more concerning, hired additional men skilled in matters beyond simple guard duty." "Assassins," Rayner said flatly, the word landing heavily in the quiet room. Osric nodded grimly. It is possible he suspects more than simple political dissent stirring against him. If rumors have reached even this village regarding a hidden nobleman, it is not impossible such whispers have traveled further than we hoped, perhaps even reaching ears connected to Garrick's growing network of informants. Alara's stomach tightened with fear as she glanced toward Rayner, watching the careful calculation working behind his steady expression. "Miriam," she said quietly, "if she has spoken carelessly to the wrong traveler, seeking coin from anyone willing to listen." "Then Garrick may already suspect I am alive," Rayner finished grimly. "Which means we no longer have the luxury of waiting for the court to gather every piece of proof before acting. We must move more quickly than originally planned." Osric's expression grew serious. "I will return within the week with the sworn testimonies formally prepared. If we present them alongside your own reappearance before the regional court, Garrick will have far greater difficulty dismissing the claims as mere rumor or jealousy from distant relations." After Osric departed as quietly as he had arrived, a heavy silence settled over the cottage. Alara moved to stand beside Rayner near the window, watching the empty forest path where their loyal steward had disappeared moments before. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly, studying the tension still visible in his posture. Rayner considered the question carefully before answering. I have been afraid since the day I woke to find my leg shattered and my guards dead around me, he admitted. But fear has never stopped me from doing what must be done. It simply makes the doing more difficult. Alara reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his own with a quiet certainty that surprised even herself. Whatever happens, she said firmly, you will not face it alone. I meant what I said before. I choose to stand beside you not out of obligation but because I have come to care for the man beneath the disguise, far more than I ever expected when this arrangement began. Raynor turned to face her fully, something deeply vulnerable softening his usually guarded expression. Alara, he said quietly, when this began, I never intended for genuine feeling to grow between us. I believed I was protecting you by keeping you at a careful distance, sparing you from dangers that were never yours to carry. Yet somewhere in these past weeks, that distance became impossible to maintain. I know, Alara whispered, her heart racing as she recognized the same quiet vulnerability in his voice that she felt building within her own chest. I feel it too. For a long, charged moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid finally beginning to find its way into the space between them. Raynor reached up gently, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that contradicted every careful, guarded gesture he had shown since their wedding day. I cannot promise you safety, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Not with Garrick's shadow still hanging over us, not until this danger is finally resolved one way or another. But I can promise you honesty, and whatever protection remains within my power to offer. That is enough, Alara whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. More than enough. The quiet moment lingered between them, fragile and precious against the backdrop of gathering danger, before Raynor finally pulled back, his expression once again settling into careful determination as the reality of their situation reasserted itself. We must prepare, he said, though his voice remained gentler than before. If Garrick's suspicion grows as Osric fears, we cannot simply wait for the court's proceedings to unfold at their own pace. We must be ready to defend ourselves, should danger arrive here before we are able to act first. Over the following days, the quiet rhythm of their life shifted once again, this time toward careful preparation rather than simple domestic routine. Raynor began teaching Alara basic defensive skills, insisting she understand how to protect herself should circumstances demand it. Osric returned twice more, each visit carrying updated information about Garrick's growing paranoia and the increasing likelihood that his suspicions had begun turning toward Ashcombe specifically. Meanwhile, Miriam's visits continued, though something in her manner shifted subtly during this time, a new confidence entering her demeanor that troubled Alara deeply. During one such visit, Miriam mentioned, almost too casually, that a well-dressed stranger had recently passed through the village, asking careful questions about local rumors and offering generous coin for reliable information. I told him nothing of value, of course, Miriam said, though her sly smile suggested otherwise. Though I imagine such generous offers might eventually loosen even the most careful tongue should the right price be offered. After Miriam's departure, Alara turned to Raynor with barely restrained alarm. She is going to sell whatever she knows. It is only a matter of time. Raynor's expression darkened with grim certainty. Then we no longer have the luxury of waiting for the court's slow proceedings. Osric must return immediately with whatever testimony he has secured, complete or not. We must be prepared to act, and quickly, before Garrick's men arrive here seeking confirmation of rumors already spreading through the region. That night, as they prepared for what both understood might be the final peaceful evening before danger arrived at their door, Alara found herself studying Raynor with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Whatever the coming days held, whatever danger Garrick's discovery might bring, she understood clearly now that she would face it standing firmly beside the man she had once been forced to marry, and had since come to love with a depth she had never expected to find within circumstances that began with such bitter unwillingness. The fire burned low between them as the quiet cottage settled into an uneasy stillness, both of them acutely aware that the fragile peace surrounding their small home would not last much longer, that somewhere beyond the dark forest, a dangerous reckoning was steadily drawing closer with each passing day. The attack came 3 nights later, without warning, beneath a moonless sky that left the forest path swallowed in near total darkness. Ilara woke suddenly to the sound of hurried footsteps outside the cottage, followed immediately by Raynor's urgent voice calling her name from below. "Ilara, wake now. Quickly!" She scrambled from the loft, her heart already pounding with fear, to find Raynor standing near the door, no longer leaning on his cane, no longer wearing the careful, humble posture he had maintained for nearly 2 years. In the dim candlelight, he looked entirely different, straight-backed and alert, his hand resting steadily on a sword she had never known was hidden within the cottage. "They have found us," he said grimly, confirming her worst fear before she could even ask. "Osric sent word only moments ago. Men matching Garrick's description of hired blades were seen approaching from the eastern road." Before Ilara could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them clearly through the thin cottage walls, growing louder with each passing second. Raynor moved quickly to the window, peering carefully into the darkness before turning back to her with steady, urgent instructions. "Stay behind me, no matter what happens," he said firmly. "Osric and the men loyal to my house are already moving to intercept them, but we may not have time to wait for their arrival." Ilara nodded, fear tightening her throat, though beneath the fear, a fierce determination steadied her racing heart. She would not simply hide while danger threatened the man she loved. The cottage door burst open moments later, 3 armed men pushing inside with weapons drawn, their faces hard and unfamiliar beneath the flickering candlelight. Ilara's breath caught sharply, but before panic could fully take hold, Raynor stepped forward decisively, positioning himself firmly between the intruders and where she stood. "You have made a grave mistake coming here," Raynor said, his voice carrying none of the humble uncertainty the village had grown accustomed to. Instead, it rang with an unmistakable authority that seemed to give even the armed men momentary pause. The lead intruder sneered, clearly unconvinced by the sudden shift in demeanor from the man they had expected to find helpless. "Lord Raynor," he said mockingly, "your cousin will be pleased to finally correct an old mistake." The confrontation that followed happened swiftly, Raynor moving with a controlled precision that left no trace of the exaggerated limp he had performed for nearly 2 years. Ilara watched, heart racing, as he defended himself skillfully against the first attacker, years of training clearly guiding every careful movement despite his old injury. Shouts erupted from outside as Osric and several loyal men arrived just as the confrontation inside reached its most dangerous point, quickly overwhelming the remaining intruders with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, the immediate danger had passed, the hired men either fleeing into the darkness or being restrained by Osric's loyal soldiers. Breathing heavily, Raynor turned immediately to Ilara, relief flooding his features as he confirmed she remained unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, closing the distance between them in a few quick strides. "No," Ilara answered, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain steady. "I am unharmed, but you, Raynor, they knew exactly who you were." "Which confirms our fears," Osric said grimly, stepping into the cottage as his men secured the perimeter outside. "Garrick knows you survived. This attack was meant to finish what the ambush at Thornridge failed to accomplish." Raynor's expression hardened with renewed resolve. "Then we no longer have any reason to remain hidden. If Garrick already knows I live, continued secrecy offers no further protection, only continued vulnerability." "The testimonies are ready," Osric confirmed. "Sworn statements from 3 witnesses now, willing to speak openly before the regional court regarding Garrick's role in the attack. Combined with your own reappearance, it should be more than sufficient to strip him of his falsely claimed position." "Then we go to the capital," Raynor said firmly. "Immediately, before Garrick has opportunity to prepare further defenses against the truth, or attempt another attack before we are able to present our case." Alara felt a fresh wave of nervous energy building within her chest at the sudden shift from quiet village life toward the far more dangerous world of noble politics and courtroom confrontation. "I am coming with you," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument in her tone. Raynor studied her carefully for a long moment before nodding, something like pride softening his tired expression. "I would not wish to leave you behind, even if you asked it of me," he admitted quietly. "You have earned the right to stand beside me through whatever comes next." Word of the attack spread quickly through Ashcombe by morning, villagers gathering in hushed, anxious clusters as rumors of armed intruders and a mysterious rescue by unknown soldiers spread rapidly. Miriam, upon hearing the news, arrived at the cottage with barely disguised panic, clearly realizing the extent of danger her careless greed had helped invite. "I did not mean for this," she said quickly, her earlier confidence entirely replaced by genuine fear. "I only wanted coin. I never intended for anyone to be harmed." Alara studied her stepmother coldly, years of resentment and this final, reckless betrayal hardening her voice. "Your greed nearly cost us everything, Miriam. Whatever happens next, know that your actions played no small part in the danger that arrived at our door." Miriam had no response beyond nervous, stammering apologies, though Alara found little patience remaining for sympathy toward the woman who had so carelessly endangered them both for the promise of easy coin. Within hours, preparations began for their journey to the regional capital, Osric organizing a small but well-armed escort to ensure their safe passage. Raynor moved through the preparations with focused determination, the quiet, humble beggar entirely replaced now by the composed, authoritative bearing of a man born to lead. As they finally departed Ashcombe, Alara riding beside Raynor for the first time since their forced wedding day, she glanced back briefly at the small village that had shaped so much of her difficult life. The villagers who had once mocked and pitied her now watched with open astonishment as the truth of Corwin's true identity began spreading rapidly through hushed, disbelieving whispers. "They will speak of this for years," Osric commented quietly as they rode, nodding toward the astonished faces watching their departure. Raynor allowed himself a small, tired smile. Let them speak. The truth was always going to surface eventually. "I am simply grateful it did not cost us more than it already has." Alara reached across the short distance between their horses, resting her hand briefly over his. "Whatever waits for us at the capital," she said quietly, "we face it together now, exactly as we promised." Raynor turned to meet her gaze, warmth and quiet determination steadying his expression despite the uncertain danger still ahead. "Together," he agreed firmly. As Ashcombe faded slowly behind them, replaced by the wider road leading toward the regional capital and the confrontation that would finally determine the fate of House Ivelmoor, Alara felt a fierce, steady resolve settle within her chest, replacing the fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of her recent life. Whatever awaited them, whatever final challenges Garrick's desperate ambition might still present, she understood clearly now that she no longer faced an uncertain, frightening future alone. She rode now not as a frightened village girl forced into an unwanted marriage, but as a woman who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand beside the man she loved, prepared to face whatever truth and danger still remained ahead of them both. The regional capital rose before them after 2 days of steady travel, its tall stone walls and busy streets a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of Ashcombe. Alara had never seen a city so grand, yet there was little time to marvel at its size, her attention fixed instead on the growing tension visible in Raynor's expression as they drew closer to the court where his cousin's fate, and their own, would soon be decided. Osric had sent word ahead, arranging for their arrival to coincide with a formal session of the regional court, where several lesser matters of noble dispute were already scheduled for hearing. Garrick, still believing himself secure in his falsely claimed position, had no reason to expect the confrontation that awaited him. They arrived at the grand hall just as the session began, slipping quietly into the gathered crowd of nobles and officials. rather than announcing their presence immediately. Alara's heart pounded as she spotted Garrick seated prominently near the front of the chamber. Dressed in fine robes that spoke of a position he had stolen through betrayal and violence. He looked younger than she expected, his features sharp and calculating, though he carried himself with the confident ease of a man who believed his secrets remained safely buried. Beside him sat several advisors, clearly comfortable in their positions of borrowed authority. The presiding judge, an elderly woman named Magistrate Verity, called the session to order, moving methodically through the scheduled matters before finally reaching the point where Osric had arranged their intervention. "Before we proceed further," Osric announced, stepping forward from the crowd with practiced confidence, "I bring before this court a matter of grave importance regarding the true leadership of House Ivelmoor." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd as Garrick's expression shifted sharply from confident ease to visible alarm. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" he demanded, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed growing unease. "The meaning," Rayner said, stepping forward fully into view for the first time, "is that the rightful heir to House Ivelmoor stands before this court very much alive, contrary to what you have allowed everyone to believe for nearly 2 years." The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs and disbelieving gasps as recognition slowly dawned across the faces of those who had once known Rayner before his supposed death. Garrick's face drained of color entirely, his earlier confidence collapsing into visible panic. "This is impossible," Garrick stammered, rising sharply from his seat. "Rayner died at Thornridge. I mourned him myself." "You did far more than mourn," Rayner said coldly, his voice carrying steady authority through the stunned silence of the chamber. "You arranged the very ambush that nearly ended my life, hiring men to ensure I did not survive. And when that failed, you allowed my father to believe his only son had died, securing your false position through grief you yourself manufactured." "Lies," Garrick shouted, though the desperation in his voice suggested otherwise. "Baseless accusations from a man desperate to reclaim what he lost through simple misfortune." Magistrate Verity raised her hand, silencing the growing chaos within the chamber. "Serious accusations require serious evidence," she said firmly, turning her attention toward Rayner. "Do you have proof to support such claims, beyond your own testimony?" Osric stepped forward immediately, presenting the carefully gathered sworn testimonies from the guards who had witnessed Garrick's role in the attack. 2 of the witnesses themselves stepped forward from among the crowd, having traveled separately to the capital under Osric's careful arrangement, offering their testimony directly before the stunned court. As each witness spoke, detailing Garrick's explicit orders during the ambush and his deliberate deception following Rayner's presumed death, the chamber's atmosphere shifted decisively. Nobles who had once supported Garrick's claimed authority now watched him with open suspicion and growing anger, recognizing the depth of betrayal he had committed against both his cousin and the family name he had falsely claimed to honor. Garrick's desperate attempts to discredit the testimony grew increasingly frantic as the evidence mounted against him, his composed authority crumbling entirely beneath the weight of truth finally brought into the light. When Magistrate Verity finally called for a formal vote among the assembled nobles regarding the legitimacy of his claimed position, the result was overwhelming and immediate. "By unanimous agreement of this court," Magistrate Verity announced formally, "the position of Duke of Ivelmoor is hereby stripped from Garrick, effective immediately, pending further investigation into charges of conspiracy and attempted murder against the rightful heir. Lord Rayner, your position and title are restored in full." The chamber erupted into a mixture of stunned applause and continued disbelief as guards moved forward to formally detain Garrick, his protests growing increasingly desperate as the full consequences of his exposed betrayal finally settled upon him. Alara watched from the crowd, relief flooding through her as the danger that had shadowed their lives for so long finally began to lift. Following the formal proceedings, Rayner turned immediately to find Alara within the dispersing crowd. His expression softening from the composed authority he had commanded before the court into something far more personal and relieved. "It is finished," he said quietly, taking her hands gently in his own. "Whatever danger remained, whatever uncertainty has shadowed us since our wedding day, it ends here." Alara felt tears building unexpectedly in her eyes, the accumulated weight of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to release. "You did it," she said softly. "You reclaimed everything that was rightfully yours." Raynor shook his head gently, something deeply sincere entering his expression. "Not everything," he corrected softly. "There remains one matter still unresolved. One I intend to correct properly now that circumstance no longer forces our arrangement." Before Alara could ask what he meant, Raynor lowered himself carefully onto one knee before her, heedless of the curious nobles still gathered nearby, watching the unexpected scene with open interest. "Alara," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability clearly visible in his expression. "Our marriage began through circumstances neither of us chose, forced upon us by others for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine affection. Yet somewhere within these difficult months, genuine affection grew regardless, deeper than I ever expected to find, especially not under such complicated beginnings." He reached into his coat, producing the same signet ring Alara had once glimpsed hidden within their cottage, though now understanding fully the significance it carried. "I am asking you now," Raynor continued, "not as the beggar you were forced to marry, nor simply as the Duke restored to his rightful position, but as the man who has come to love you completely. Will you remain my wife, this time by your own free choice, and stand beside me as Duchess of Ivelmoor?" Alara felt tears spill freely down her cheeks as she nodded, her voice thick with emotion as she answered. "Yes," she said firmly. "Not out of obligation, not out of circumstance, but because I choose you, freely and completely, exactly as you have just asked." The small crowd of nobles who had gathered to witness the unexpected proposal broke into genuine, warm applause, a stark contrast to the cold, unwilling ceremony that had first bound them together within the small chapel of Ashcombe. In the weeks that followed, word of the dramatic reversal spread rapidly throughout the region, reaching even the small village of Ashcombe, where villagers who had once mocked Alara's forced marriage to a crippled beggar now spoke in hushed, astonished tones about the true identity of the man they had so carelessly dismissed. Miriam, upon learning the full truth of Raynor's restored position, arrived at their temporary residence within the capital with desperate apologies and thinly veiled requests for continued generosity, though Alara, now secure in her position and finally free from her stepmother's manipulation, offered only measured, distant courtesy in return. Their formal wedding, held properly this time within the grand chapel of Ivelmoor's restored estate, stood in stark contrast to the hurried, humiliating ceremony that had first bound them together. Alara stood before gathered nobles and loyal household members alike, dressed in fine silk rather than the plain, borrowed dress she had worn on that first difficult day, her hand steady within Raynor's own as they exchanged vows freely chosen rather than forced upon them. As the ceremony concluded, and cheers rose warmly through the grand hall, Alara glanced toward Raynor, finding in his expression the same quiet warmth and genuine affection that had grown steadily between them since those first uncertain days within their humble cottage at the edge of Ashcombe's forest. "From beggar to duke," she said softly, echoing quietly the very rumor that had once defined their beginning, "and from unwilling bride to duchess." Raynor smiled warmly, drawing her close despite the watching crowd. "Whatever titles circumstance placed upon us," he said quietly, "I am simply grateful fate brought us together, however unwillingly it began." As their story spread throughout the region, becoming something between legend and cautionary tale for those who judged too quickly based on appearance alone, Alara found herself settling into her new life not merely as Duchess of Ivelmoor, but as a woman who had discovered genuine love within the most unexpected and difficult circumstances imaginable, a love strong enough to survive deception, danger, and betrayal. Emerging stronger and more genuine than either of them could have anticipated on that cold, humiliating morning when their story first began. Autumn settled over Ivelmoor's wide estate within a few months of the formal wedding, bringing with it the steady, demanding work of rebuilding a household that had spent nearly 2 years under the mismanagement of a false duke. Rainer threw himself into the task with the same quiet determination Alara had come to admire, reviewing every decision Garrick had made, correcting unfair taxes imposed on struggling farmers, and restoring trust among tenants who had grown wary during his cousin's brief and troubled rule. Alara found her own place within this new life more gradually, uncertain at first how a woman raised in a small village could take her place among the polished manners of noble society. Yet she discovered quickly that her years of hardship had given her something many highborn ladies lacked: a genuine understanding of the struggles faced by the common families now under Ivelmoor's protection. She began visiting the outlying farms personally, listening to concerns that stewards often overlooked, ensuring that promised repairs to granaries and bridges were completed rather than quietly forgotten. The tenants, initially uncertain of their new duchess, grew to respect her steady presence and genuine attention to their daily struggles. "You have a gift for this," Rainer observed one evening, watching her review a list of requested repairs with careful focus. "Most nobles never trouble themselves to learn the names of the families living on their land, let alone their specific hardships." "I have not forgotten what it means to go without," Alara replied simply. "It seems only right to use whatever position I now hold to ensure fewer families endure what mine once did." Word eventually reached them that Garrick, following a lengthy formal investigation, had been stripped entirely of any remaining claim to noble standing and exiled from the region, forbidden from ever returning to lands once under his false authority. Though some among the court had argued for harsher punishment, Rainer had quietly requested leniency, explaining privately to Alara that continued bitterness would serve no one, least of all a household already working hard to move beyond the shadow of betrayal. "He took nearly everything from me," Rainer admitted one night. "My father's final years, 2 years of my own life spent hidden and disguised, the trust of people who once looked to my family for fair leadership. I will not allow him to take my peace as well, not now that it has finally been restored." Alara admired this quiet strength in him, the ability to move forward without being consumed entirely by old grievances, even as she understood the depth of what Garrick's betrayal had truly cost them both. That winter, Nora traveled from Ashcombe to visit, her excitement at seeing her childhood friend settled into such an extraordinary new life evident from the moment she arrived at Ivelmoor's grand gates. The two friends spent hours catching up, Nora marveling at the transformation of the quiet, humiliated bride she had once comforted outside a small village chapel. "I always suspected there was more to that man than the village believed," Nora admitted, laughing softly as they walked together through Ivelmoor's gardens. "Though I confess, even I never imagined quite this much more." Alara smiled warmly, looping her arm through her old friend's. "Neither did I, truthfully. I spent our first weeks together convinced I had been condemned to a hopeless life." "And now?" Nora asked, glancing meaningfully around the grand estate surrounding them. "Now," Alara said softly, "I understand that circumstance forced our beginning, but everything since has been built through genuine choice, difficult as that path became at times." As the seasons continued to turn, Ivelmoor slowly regained the stability and fairness it had known under Rainer's father. Tenants once again trusting their leadership, trade routes once disrupted by Garrick's mismanagement steadily restored to their former reliability. Rainer proved himself a capable and thoughtful duke, balancing firm decisions with genuine compassion learned, perhaps, from his own years spent living among the very people his position now required him to protect. Osric remained a constant, trusted presence within their household, formally elevated to a position of significant authority within Ivelmoor's governing council, his years of quiet loyalty finally rewarded with the recognition and respect they had long deserved. Nearly a year after their formal wedding, Alara discovered she was carrying their first child, news that brought profound joy to both of them, though it also stirred quiet reflection on how far their journey had carried them from that cold, humiliating morning, when Miriam had dragged her unwillingly through Ashcombe's streets toward a marriage neither of them had chosen. "Our child will grow up knowing none of the uncertainty we once faced," Raynor said quietly one evening, resting his hand gently over Ilara's growing belly as they sat together near the fire of their private chambers, a far grander hearth than the humble one that had once warmed their small forest cottage. "No," Ilara agreed softly, "but perhaps it is worth remembering where we began, so they understand that true worth is never measured by appearance or circumstance alone." Raynor smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "A lesson I learned rather thoroughly myself, disguised as a beggar for 2 long years, only to discover that the woman forced into marrying me held more genuine strength and worth than any noble lady I might have chosen through more conventional means." As winter gave way once again to spring, and their daughter was born healthy and strong within the walls of Ivelmoor's grand estate, Ilara found herself reflecting often on the strange, difficult path that had led her to this life of unexpected happiness. The village of Ashcombe, once the site of her deepest humiliation, remained forever tied to the beginning of a story that had transformed entirely beyond anything she could have imagined on that cold, frightening wedding day. Miriam, though never fully welcomed back into genuine favor, was eventually granted a modest allowance sufficient to live comfortably, a decision Ilara made not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a desire to close that painful chapter of her life without lingering bitterness weighing on her new happiness. Years later, as their daughter grew alongside a younger brother born 2 years after her, Ilara would sometimes tell them the story of how their parents first met, softening certain difficult details for young ears, yet always emphasizing the same central truth that had carried her through those uncertain early months. "Never judge a person's worth by what the world assumes about them," she would tell her children, echoing quietly the lesson she herself had learned through fear, uncertainty, and eventually, genuine love found in the most unexpected of circumstances. Sometimes the truest strength hides beneath the humblest appearance, waiting patiently for someone willing to look beyond first impressions to discover what truly lies beneath. And in the quiet moments when Raynor would join these storytelling evenings, taking her hand gently in his own as their children listened wide-eyed to the tale of the lame beggar who was truly a duke, Ilara would feel once again that same fierce gratitude that had first bloomed within her during those difficult, uncertain weeks in their small forest cottage. Gratitude for a love that had grown not despite its difficult beginning, but perhaps, in some strange way, because of it. Their story became something of a quiet legend throughout the region in the years that followed, a tale told among common folk and nobles alike, a reminder that circumstance and appearance rarely tell the full truth of a person's character, and that genuine love, once given the chance to grow honestly, could flourish even from the most unlikely and difficult of beginnings.